The letter was yellowed with time, its edges curled from decades in a drawer. Frank Delaney held it in his hand like it might vanish if he gripped it too hard. The ink was faded, but still, legible words written by a commander who never made it. Home, to the bravest man I've ever served with. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. You did, and that means the world still has some good in it. Frank's fingers trembled, not from the early winter chill seeping into the walls of his modest Ohio home, but from something deeper, a memory long buried, a weight he'd carried in silence. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the wooden box. Beside the silver star and the tattered patch from Charlie Company, his morning routine had always been the same. Wake up at 5:15, coffee, sit with the paper, but never read it. Glance at the empty chair across from him. That was Ellie's chair. She passed 3 winters ago, but this morning was different. Frank had woken up with a pulse in his chest he hadn't felt in years, not since Saigon. Today. He was going to the base, not to protest, not to visit, but to hand-deliver what he'd promised Captain Moore all those years ago. The patch, the letter, the medal. They belong in the hands of those who still wear the uniform. He whispered to no one, his voice sandpapered by age. Frank pulled on the thick wool coat Ellie had sewn patches in 2 decades earlier. He tucked the folded letter in the other, the medal, and in a small pouch around his neck. The company patch frayed, stained real by 8 a.m. Frank was outside, walking slowly toward Fort Ryland. His cane tapped the pavement with a steady rhythm. Every few steps, he stopped to breathe. Not just because of the distance, but because memories tend to rise when you're heading back toward where everything started. The entrance to the base hadn't changed. Tall iron gates, polished brass sign, American flag flying proud against a cloudless sky. 2 guards stood at the post, young, muscular, sharp, haircuts, names stitched into uniforms, PVT Jenkins and PVT. Sloan. Frank reached into his coat and pulled out the medal and letter. I'd like to donate these to the historical wing. They belonged to Captain Morkia, 71. Vietnam. Jenkins squinted. Sir, do you have clearance to approach the base? Frank nodded once. I served here once. Thought it'd be right to bring these back. Sloan stepped forward. We don't take walk-in donations, especially not unsolicited items. Frank looked him in the eye. These aren't just items, son. This is history. It's sacrifice. Jenkins chuckled under his breath. Right? Well, history or not, you're not authorized. And frankly, this place isn't a museum for old ghosts. The words landed like a slap. Frank straightened, his face unreadable. I fought with men braver than most statues in your barracks. This letter is from a man who died covering our retreat. I carried it for 52 years. Sloan shrugged. Yeah, and now we've got protocols. The wind picked up. Cold, bitter. Frank's eyes scanned the gate, the young soldiers, the landscape. He had stood at gates like these before. Once to ship out, once to return. This time he felt more like a trespasser in a world that had outgrown its memory behind him. A few civilians waited to be escorted onto base for a tour. Frank could feel their eyes. He wasn't imagining the mutters. Who is he? Maybe he's lost. Poor guy. Probably has dementia. Sloan grabbed the radio from his belt. Base command, we've got a civilian at the gate. Elderly male, possibly unstable, requesting instructions. Frank's grip tightened on his cane. The letter shook in his hand, not from fear, but rage. Invisible rage. I was stable enough to carry 2 wounded soldiers through gunfire in Dak 2, he said under his breath. But no one was listening. Jenkins gestured outward. Look, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful, but you need to go. Take your letter and medal with you. Frank looked at him for a long time, then down at the items in his hand. He could have shouted, could have told them what he did, what more, did what they all did. But some wars never end. They just get quieter. Frank turned, heart pounding not from exertion but from the ache of being forgotten. The base grew smaller behind him with every step. In its place grew something heavier. Finality. By the time he reached home, the sun was starting to lower in the sky. He placed the letter and medal back into the wooden box and closed the lid with a soft thud. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He sat on the porch and wept. He wept for the boys who never came. Home, He wept for the world that moved on without. Remembering, he wept because something inside him finally broke. He didn't notice the time, didn't hear the convoy until it was right in front of his house, 2 black SUVs, 1 armored Humvee. Military insignia glinting in the sunlight, and from the lead vehicle, stepped out a man in full-dress uniform, General Alan Weaver, a name Frank hadn't heard in 5 decades, not since they were both fresh-faced boys sweating in the jungles of Quang Tri. Frank stood up slowly, wiping his face with the sleeve of his coat as the engine rumble faded. He stared at the vehicles parked outside his home in stunned silence. The SUV door opened. Out stepped a tall man with silver hair, rigid posture, and eyes that had seen combat. General Alan Weaver, Frank Delaney, he said softly, removing his cap with reverence. Frank blinked Weaver. The name came out like a breath from the past. Alan took a slow step forward. "It's been a long time, Sergeant. 52 years, give or take." Frank nodded, his throat tight. Too long. Behind the general, 2 junior officers stood stiffly at attention, and next to them, Jenkins and Sloan, now in full-dress uniform, shoulders squared, faces pale and uneasy. They avoided Frank's gaze. The general's voice was low but firm. "You came to the base this morning with a letter, a medal, a memory." Frank nodded. "They wouldn't let you in." "That's all right," Frank said quickly, the old instinct to diffuse tension still alive. They were doing their job. "No," Weaver replied sharply. "They weren't." He turned his head toward Jenkins and Sloan. "They forgot what the uniform means, but I didn't." Frank's porch creaked as he stepped back and gestured. "You boys want to come inside?" The general shook his head. "Not yet. First, there's something we need to fix." He turned to the Humvee and gave a quick signal. From the vehicle, a folded chair was retrieved and a ceremonial stand was placed on the lawn. One of the junior officers stepped forward and set a small loudspeaker on the porch rail. Neighbors peeked from windows, some stepping outside as the scene grew. Weaver stood on the grass like it was a battlefield. He faced Frank, then turned toward Jenkins and Sloan. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting through the cool afternoon air, "you stand before a man who fought under fire, carried brothers on his back through mud and bullets, and returned with scars deeper than flesh. And this morning, you dismissed him, mocked him." Sloan's jaw clenched. Jenkins's hands tightened behind his back. Frank looked away, but Weaver held up a hand. "Not yet, Frank. You need to hear this." He turned back to the young men. 52 years ago, I was pinned behind a blown-out tank near the Laos border. My unit was surrounded. I was sure we were done until this man, Frank Delaney, charged through open fire with a busted M14 and a radio half full of static. He called in the evac. He dragged 2 men to safety, and he never once asked for a medal. The street was now fully awake. Neighbors watched from doorsteps, some recording, some saluting. "Do you understand who you turned away this morning?" the general asked. Jenkins finally raised his head. "Sir, we didn't know. We thought he was just a relic." Weaver cut in. "A ghost, a burden." Sloan stepped forward slightly. "No, sir, just didn't think he was a man who saved my life," Weaver snapped. Silence fell again. Frank looked down at the porch floor. The cane in his hand now felt lighter somehow. The weight in his chest didn't. Weaver turned to him. "Frank, if you'll allow it, I'd like to return what was taken from you this morning. Your dignity." Frank cleared his throat. "You didn't take it." "No," the general said, "but we forgot it. And that's worse." He turned to his officers. A small mahogany box was brought forward. Weaver opened it and removed a new, clean-folded American flag. He walked up to Frank and handed it over. "We want this one to sit next to the one you carried all these years, one for memory, one for legacy." Frank accepted it, hands steady now. Behind Weaver, Jenkins and Sloan stepped forward. "Sir," Jenkins said, removing his cap, "I owe you an apology. I spoke with ignorance and arrogance." "I'm sorry," Sloan followed. "Sir, I disrespected someone I should have saluted. I hope you can forgive that." Frank studied the 2 boys for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Do either of you know what Charlie Company's motto was in 71? They shook their heads. "Earn the quiet, not the medals, not the headlines. Just the quiet you feel when you've done something right." They nodded, words catching in their throats. Frank gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then you've taken the first step. The general turned toward the growing crowd. This man didn't ask for recognition. He didn't send letters or demand a ceremony. He came to honor the dead. And he was turned away by a system that forgot the foundation it's built on. A hush fell over the street. We can't undo what happened at the gate, Weaver said, but we can make sure it never happens again. He turned to Frank. I want to extend an invitation on behalf of the Department of the Army to be the guest of honor at Fort Ryland's Founders' Day. Next Sunday. Frank hesitated. I haven't worn dress shoes in over a decade, he joked softly. The general smiled. I'll make sure we match. They shook hands. Not the kind of handshake you give for show, the kind you give to someone who saved your life. Frank looked out at the crowd. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but today his silence had been broken, and someone finally was listening. Inside the house, the wooden box remained on the table. Next to it sat the new flag, smooth and bright, and a letter that, for the first time in decades, had been read aloud again, not just by a voice, but by a nation that nearly forgot how much it owed. The sun crested over Fort Ryland 1 week later, painting the sky in streaks of soft gold and pale blue. A light wind tugged at the flags lining the compound's entrance. Rows of folding chairs filled the parade ground. Soldiers in formal dress stood in neat formation. Civilians, veterans, and schoolchildren gathered, their murmurs hushed by anticipation. At the far end of the stage stood General Allen Weaver, crisp in his uniform, scanning the crowd with the quiet poise of a man who had seen war and seen it cost too much. Then came the moment. From the front of the crowd, escorted by 2 junior officers and wearing his best black suit, the same one he wore the day he married Ellie Frank Delaney, stepped onto the stage. In his arms, a folded flag. In his breast pocket, the silver star, and on his face calm, the same calm that steadied his hands 52 years ago when bullets tore through the jungle. The same calm he wore when Jenkins called him a burden just a week earlier. But this time, it was different. As Frank reached the podium, the crowd stood. A full standing ovation. Cameras flashed. Cadets saluted. Some older veterans wept. Weaver raised his hand, and the field fell quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is Sergeant First Class Frank Delaney. He has not asked for a microphone, a speech, or a ceremony. He only asked that we remember. He stepped aside. Frank stared at the sea of faces, then slowly unfolded the letter from Captain Moore. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't have to. He simply held it up for the crowd to see. This letter has been with me since March 12, 1971, Frank said quietly. It belonged to a man who gave his life so others could go home. He asked me to bring it back someday. I thought I had. Time but time. It slips away. He paused, swallowing hard. When I came here last week, I brought this letter and a medal, not for glory, not for attention, but because I was tired of carrying it alone. He looked toward Jenkins and Sloan, seated front row, now listening, with genuine reverence. Some of you are young enough to have never known war. Others carry pieces of it you wish you could forget. But every soldier, whether in battle or in silence, deserves to be remembered. He lifted the medal in one hand and the flag in the other. These were never mine. They were always ours. Frank stepped down and walked toward General Weaver, placing the medal and flag into his hands. With your permission, General, he said, I'd like these to stay here so that no one forgets. Weaver accepted them, bowing his head. With honor, he said. As Frank returned to his seat, the crowd stood again. No cheers, just silence, a silence more powerful than any applause. Later that day, in the base's Hall of Valor, the folded flag, the medal, and Captain Moore's letter were placed behind glass, beneath a plaque that read, "In memory of those who carried the burden without asking for glory." Donated by SFC Frank Delaney, U.S. Army Ret. Outside the hall, Jenkins and Sloan approached him. "Sir," Jenkins said, clearing his throat, "we've been assigned to the memorial wing." "General Weaver's orders?" Frank raised an eyebrow, voluntarily. "No," Sloan said with a slight grin, "but we asked to stay. We want to learn the stories. We want to make sure we never make that mistake again." Frank nodded. "Then you're already doing better than most." They exchanged salutes. This time, it wasn't forced. It was earned. That evening, Frank returned to his small house, his porch still quiet. The shadows familiar. He sat in his recliner and looked at Ellie's photo. "I did it," he whispered. "They know now, and that weight, it's not so heavy." "Any more?" He closed his eyes, somewhere between memory and sleep. He could almost hear Captain Moore's voice again. "Good work, Delaney. You made it count." A few weeks later, a video of Frank's speech went viral. Millions watched an old man walk onto a stage and remind a nation what dignity looked like. Veterans from every state sent letters. Young cadets quoted his words at graduation. A bronze statue. A Frank was commissioned for the Fort Ryland Memorial Garden. And in every hallway of the base, one phrase echoed louder than commands.